VBM is about raising our Jewish learning to the next level. It's about building broad, inclusive community beyond divides. It's about training young leaders to create change. It's about inspiring and fostering innovation in our community. It's about creating spaces for sophisticated, respectful, tolerant discourse on key issues to support collaboration and growth in our community. And mostly, it's about lighting our flames. We're all looking for inspiration and fire and passion in our lives, and I believe we must constantly grow intellectually and spiritually to be alive. We have a great partner with us tonight who represents these core values better than anyone I know. It's a great honor and delight to introduce our dynamic speaker tonight. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the founding rabbi of Ikar, which in Hebrew means essence. Ikar is a Jewish community in Los Angeles which describes its mission as to reanimate Jewish life through soulful religious and spiritual practice that is rooted in a deep commitment to social justice. Ikar was named one of the nation's 50 most innovative Jewish nonprofits in Slingshot, a resource guide for Jewish innovation, for 6 consecutive years. Rabbi Brous completed her bachelor's and master's in human rights from Columbia University and was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. She was included in the Forward's annual list of the 50 most influential members of the American Jewish community for 3 consecutive years, and was included on Newsweek's annual list of 50 influential rabbis for 5 consecutive years. And in 2013, the last year of the list, she became the first woman named #1 on the Newsweek list. Rabbi Brous blessed the president and the vice president at the inaugural National Prayer Service. In fact, every time I've been to the White House over the years, she's always there. I'm convinced that she's more at the White House than in Los Angeles. Rabbi Brous has the courage to experiment. She has the conviction to include. She has the will to lead with passion. Sharon is not only smart, fervent, and cutting edge, she's also sweet and kind and thoughtful and present. It is a great, great honor tonight to call upon my role model, my colleague, my friend. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Sharon Brous.
Wow, after an introduction like that, I feel maybe we should just end the night right now so that we actually achieve all the expectations. Thank you so much to my friend, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz. I was thinking as you were speaking and asking us to talk about what inspired us. I heard a teaching from a rabbi a couple of years ago who said, what is the opposite of include? Exclude. And what is the opposite of inhale? And what is the opposite of inspire? So as Rabbi Shmuley brings his passion and his love, not only of Jewish peoplehood, but actually of Jewish people, which is much harder. He really shares his inspiration with every group that he touches. I first met Rabbi Shmuley when I was teaching at Wexner several years ago, and he was still a young rabbinical student at the time, and clearly a person whose soul was on fire, ready to go out and do what he could to bring a deeper sense of Torah, of purpose, responsibility to the Jewish people and to the world. So thank you so much. And I'm also so grateful to Rabbi Michael Kaplan and to Stan and Cheryl, who've been only so kind since we got here. And thank you for that really beautiful introduction. So as many of you know, we were originally scheduled to do this several weeks ago, and my beloved grandma, Millie Gordon, died just a couple days before. So we were in funeral and then Shiva, and so we had to reschedule. And several of you have so kindly asked, just in the few moments with the Start Me Up Fellows and then on the way down, to just share something about my grandma, which touched me so deeply, and I appreciate that so much. So I'm actually going to start with a story from my grandma, which has nothing to do with my talk tonight. I don't think. We'll see if we can make a connection. But just one of my favorite stories about my beautiful grandma. So we went down to visit her in October. I was with my mother and my middle child, who is about to turn 8 years old. And we went out to dinner. My grandma was 98 years old and in great health until the day she died, thank God. And so we went out to dinner, and Stan might know this story because I did, if you listen to the podcast, you may have heard this. I couldn't help myself but share it at Ikar, and I reserve the right to share it again at the High Holy Days, so because it's that good, I think. So we were sitting out at dinner, and at the table right beside us in the restaurant area where the old folks ate in their old folks' home, so the most beautiful thing happened. There was a man in his 90s and a woman in her 90s, and in the middle of the meal, he reached across the table and he took her hand and he started to sing her a love song. And my mom and I both burst into tears. And so Grandma says from across the table, "Why are you crying? What happened over there?" And I said, "Grandma, it's so beautiful. You know, even after all of these years, he still loves his wife so dearly. It's really touching." And she said, "Yeah, Sharon, that's really beautiful, but that woman is not his wife." She said, "His wife's in the hospital." So, anyway, my grandma lived and died with a great sense of humor. So in her memory, I'm very, very happy to be with you here tonight. So to totally switch gears, just gonna, let's see. Okay. I have been, as I'm sure many of you have been over the course of the past couple of weeks, incredibly moved by the story of the kidnapping of these Nigerian girls. 200-something girls kidnapped from their school by a terrorist organization whose name they are dedicated in name and in mission to making sure that girls do not have a chance to become literate, to study, and to be able to build a life of purpose. And one of the things that I have found myself really dwelling on and thinking about is the early stories that came out once it became clear that the Nigerian government was not going to respond with a real sense of urgency to go out and rescue these girls. The stories of their parents who went out into the woods to fight a well-armed militia, a terrorist organization, with nothing but sticks and bows and arrows. And it has struck me over the course of the past several weeks that this is an act of incredible courage and incredible love. When I first heard about this, I started to think immediately about the women of Liberia. So another country not so far away, where the women, after 14 years of really a devastating civil war that essentially destroyed civil society in the entire country, there was not a single medical clinic or single school still open throughout the entire country after incredible violence and devastation to the human beings and to the economy and to the culture, essentially stood up and said, "We will no longer stand for what has become normative in our society, and we demand that something is done to make a change." I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of the women, but I find it particularly poignant that it was women who did it. And in fact, the woman, Leymah Gbowee, who happened to have won a Nobel Peace Prize just a couple of years ago for her extraordinary courage, she tells this story in her autobiography of the moment that changed her life. She was a mother of 4, married to an abusive husband. Her house had been destroyed. Her family had been destroyed. And she went to bed one night and had a dream. And in the dream, she heard a voice that said to her, "Gather the women and pray for peace." She was not a person who was used to hearing voices, nor was she a person who was used to acting on her dreams. She was just a young and desperate and devastated human being. But she got up early in the morning, like the women in the town of Rosa Parks after they learned of Rosa Parks' arrest, and she put up signs all around Monrovia in Liberia, signs that said, "Women of Liberia, come join me and pray for peace." And she wrote that all of the women were to join at 5 a.m. in the fish market the next day. And she got there early the next morning, and nobody was there. And she thought, what if it totally failed, this effort? And then what will we do for peace? But then soon the women started trickling in, a couple of women at a time, and then a few dozen women. And before noon that day, there were several thousand women who risked their lives to go out between the fire of the government troops and the militia in order to take a stand to fight for peace. I've been thinking about these Nigerian parents. I've been thinking about the girls who managed to escape themselves from the woods. I've been thinking about these Liberian women, because it strikes me that every now and then we are brought to a question of what courage is and what cowardice is. And these questions reemerge in the public consciousness when we see extraordinary acts of one or the other. And we see many acts of cowardice, just as we see some acts of courage as well. So I've taken a real interest in the study of courage and cowardice over the course of the past several years. And I've read a number of studies that have been that have been written over the course of the past many decades to try to understand why it is that under certain circumstances some people will act and other people will stand by silently. Why some people will take to the streets and other people will shutter their windows and lock their doors. So a lot of the studies that have been done in this field of thought, which some of you I'm sure have read and know quite well, and we may even have some social psychologists in the room, in some of these studies, emergency situations are staged in order to determine the likelihood of decent people to step up and risk something in order to achieve the outcome that they want. And these studies have consistently shown one effect, which is that individuals will rarely intervene on another person's behalf to stop violence, to protect victims, if they themselves are not directly targeted. In other words, given the chance to be a hero, most people will fail, and most people will fail miserably. You know, this outcome is found to be multiplied many times over if there are many people who witness an act of violence or a moment or an opportunity to actually step up. If one person sees something terrible happen, that person will probably not do anything. But if 20 people see it, all the more likely that they won't actually do anything. Why? Because they believe that if other people are not engaging, that really it's not appropriate for them to engage themselves. There are a lot of good reasons why people don't step up and intervene when they witness an act of violence, when they encounter a social policy that they find incredibly awful, when they witness a social environment or a social situation where they see that someone is being humiliated or harmed. So, and what we see is that this effect is actually replicated not only in the studies that social scientists produce, but also on the street. And we may not want to believe it, but statistically and historically, as we know, especially as Jews, even when the stakes are the highest, people are truly unlikely to step up and change their own patterns of behavior to intervene on someone else's behalf. A couple weeks ago, I went on vacation with my family, a greatly needed vacation. And so there I was with my kids. We went out to the beach. And I saw something that sort of disturbed me, just about maybe 30 feet away on the beach. It was a man with presumably his wife and their son. And the woman looked like she was either passed out or really drunk or overdosed or maybe sunstroked. And I became really disturbed because I noticed that this woman wasn't moving. It seemed beyond sunbathing. So I finally got up after looking for several minutes to see, and I went over and I asked the men, is she okay? And both of the men said, oh yeah, she's fine. She was just out way too late last night and maybe she drank a little bit too much. So I actually thought to myself, you know, her husband and her son don't seem too concerned, so maybe I shouldn't be either. Maybe I'm just being a kind of overprotective Jewish mother that I am, and maybe I should just leave this one alone. You know, there are two determinants in the studies that consistently counter the effects of the bystander hypothesis. One of them The first is when the witness identifies with the person who's being victimized by the policy or by the real life action. If you feel a kind of kinship for the person who you think is struggling and could use your support, maybe of gender or religion or race or ethnicity, the odds are that you might step in to intervene, whereas you would not have necessarily done that before. In other words, we step in to save our own people much more quickly than we would step in to save somebody who does not look like us. This is really a problem for us, obviously, because our society is so fragmented. And as globalization and technology have taken even more of an effect on our culture and on our society, we are left with even more pervasive feelings of isolation and disconnection. So we're less likely now to fight for each other than we would have before. And yet, studies and history show that when we do feel a sense of connectedness to one another, we just might be more likely to step up. So the first question I want to look at tonight, with my terribly sad story of the woman who couldn't move on the beach in the backdrop, with the Liberian women in the backdrop, and with these Nigerian girls and their very courageous parents in the backdrop, is, what does Judaism, what does the Jewish tradition have to offer or say to us about cultivating a sense of social connectedness and true social responsibility to one another? What would it take, in other words, for us to feel a deeper sense of connection with each other and with other human beings, so that when the moment comes and we're given the opportunity to step forward and stand up and actually speak out on someone else's behalf, we will actually take it? This is the first thing that I want for us to talk about tonight. Now, I want to go back all the way to the beginning of the book of Genesis to look at this question, to the conflict that came up between Cain and Abel. We have no idea what happened between these two brothers when they got into a fight one day out in the field and Cain killed Abel. What we do know is that God approaches Cain shortly after he murdered his brother, and God said to Cain, Ehav el achicha, where is your brother Abel? And Cain famously responds by saying, am I my brother's keeper? Hashomer achi anochi. Now, God does not answer the question that Cain asks. God does not say, yes, you are your brother's keeper. And in fact, that question is left open for the remainder of the entire book of Genesis. And tragically, in story after story that we see throughout the generations after Cain and Abel, it seems that the answer to the question is actually no. So think about it. Ishmael and Isaac cannot figure out how to live together. Jacob deceives Esau. The brothers oscillate between, should we kill our brother Joseph or should we just sell him into slavery? In some ways, it seems that the entire book of Genesis is an attempt to answer the question that Cain asks after murdering his brother, am I responsible? And the answer is, no, you're not responsible for your brother. And yet, just as the book of Genesis is about to wind down, we have an episode in which there is a famine that ravages Canaan. And the people have to go down to Egypt in order to beg for food because they're very hungry. The second time that they go down, Joseph, who's now the second in command to Pharaoh, which they did not know because, of course, he was in disguise, Joseph plants a goblet in Benjamin's sack. And he insists that all the other brothers go home, but Benjamin's going to be able to stay with him as his slave. And in this moment, this becomes, I believe, the decisive moment in the book of Genesis, because Judah actually steps forward. And when Joseph says, Alu l'shalom el avichem, go home in peace to your father, brothers, and just leave little Benjamin here, Judah steps up and says, how can there be peace for me if there's no peace for my brother? Now, if you're familiar with the story, you may not realize just how radical this is. But every other episode between brothers, up until this point, from the beginning of creation, as it's recorded in Genesis, is one in which the brother does not stand up for his brother in distress. But here Judah breaks script, and he says, if Benjamin stays, we're all going to stay, because we are all in this together. In other words, Judah offers a response to all of the generations that came before him, in which he says that Israel has now learned how to answer the critical and underlying question of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, Hashomer Achi Anochi, and the answer is an undeniable affirmation that yes, we are actually responsible for one another, whether we like it or not, whether it's convenient or not. Now you might wonder why God didn't just give Cain that answer in the very beginning of the Torah. It would have saved us a lot of pain and a lot of heartache. But I believe that God needed for human beings to come to this answer on our own. And too often we only come to this answer through failure and not actually through success. So what happens here is that Judah rewrites the history of the people Israel, and he makes a tikkun for the sin of Cain. He makes a repair for the terrible mistake that Cain made in taking his brother's life, and also for all of the offenses that were committed throughout the book of Genesis. And in an instant, the Jewish script shifts from one of radical aloneness, in which we are all distinct individuals whose job it is to take care of ourselves and ourselves only, into a script of love and shared responsibility. That's our story, says the book of Genesis. Like it or not, comfortable or not, your story is my story. Your pain is my problem. Your destiny is my sacred responsibility. That's what it means to be a Jew. And that's how the book of Genesis closes. It's like the famous piece of Talmud that so many people learn in day school or in religious school that says, Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. Every Jew is responsible or must take responsibility for every other. It's not obvious. It's not obvious. How do we learn this? Because in the book of Leviticus, there's a verse that says that one of the curses that will strike the people Israel is that they will stumble all over each other as if they're fleeing from the sword, but nobody's actually pursuing them. And the rabbis ask, what does it mean they're going to stumble all over each other? And they suggest that they will stumble from one another's own mistakes, that everybody becomes liable in this community for everyone else's mistakes, that everyone is held accountable for everyone else's sins and for their problems. So think about it for a moment. If a Jew makes a bad choice or an unethical decision in, say, New York or Los Angeles, it reflects on Jews in Phoenix, right? And when a Jew wins the Nobel Prize, it reflects on the Jews of Phoenix, right? We all pay the price. We all share the pride. The reality is that we are all, in some way, as marginalized as we might feel, or as connected as we might feel, we are all somehow connected to one another. Or as it said in the Midrash, it said that Israel is like a scattered sheep in the book of Jeremiah. And the rabbis say, how is Israel like a scattered sheep? And the answer they come up with is, they're just like an animal. They're just like a sheep. If the arm of a sheep hurts, the whole thing is out of commission. If a sheep breaks its leg, even its head is not okay, right? So if one part hurts, the entirety is in disrepair. We are all one. This is a pretty radical idea. When you hurt, I feel pain. I once heard a parent who said, you're only as happy as your least happy child. You're only as happy as your least happy child, because it is utterly impossible for us to disentangle from one another, even though we so yearn for disentanglement. We want to live with the myth of radical individuality, but in reality, we are all one. Okay, you might think, okay, so Judah will step up on behalf of Benjamin, but maybe that's because Benjamin's his brother. And maybe what we should learn from this is that we need to step up for our family, or even for our extended family, for our clan. But what about for the rest of humanity? We have no indication that we should do that. Well, there's a famous story that the rabbis tell, which maybe you've heard. It's a story of a group of travelers who are out on a ship. And one of them starts boring a hole through the bottom of the boat under his own seat. And all of the other travelers on the boat say to him, "Are you mad? What are you doing?" And he says, "What do you care? It's only under my own seat." And they say, "Are you crazy? You're going to sink this boat for all of us? Well, it strikes me that in a time of globalization, when we have incredible access to one another's stories and to one another's lives, when we knew the names of every single child of the shooting in Newtown, when we see the stories and images of so many of the victims in Syria and in Nigeria and all around the world, of those kids on the ferry in South Korea, how can we say that what happens under my boat does not affect the rest of the journey for the rest of us? I remember reading a story about a year and a half ago after the tsunami happened in Japan. It was a story about a soccer ball that had washed up on the shore in Alaska. So a guy who was walking out on this deserted patch of beach in Alaska finds a soccer ball, and it's got Japanese writing all over it. So he snaps a shot of it and he puts it up on the internet. And a kid in Japan who had lost everything in the tsunami saw a picture of his soccer ball posted on the internet from some guy in Alaska, and was actually able to retrieve one object, one precious remnant of his childhood and of his past. It strikes me that when our toxic waste spreads from one community and one state into another, when our soccer balls float all the way across the ocean, we no longer are in a position to claim that we and we alone are affected when we bore holes in our boats. You know, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes says, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. But I sometimes think that the world stands in protest to this notion, because I don't know that before us, anyone could have imagined that we would have instant access to the kind of information, the intimate knowledge of people living worlds away that we now have. And I believe that that offers us a distinct set of responsibilities that come with living in a different and previously unimaginable era. I remember reading a story in 2004 after the massive tsunami that happened that was called "Tragedy in Asia Affects All Corners of a Closer World." And this article in the New York Times said that aside from the calamitous destruction to over 12 countries which were directly hit by the tsunami, this was a tragedy that was felt across the globe. There were reported deaths from people of over 40 nationalities, people from South Africa to South Korea, from Sweden to Israel. And this article said that the disaster's reach is an unsettling reminder that globalization has brought the world closer together in unexpected ways, so that people now share pain as well as profit from far-flung places. Can the human heart hold the depths of pain and suffering that it encounters when we have such instant and immediate access? Our instinct, of course, is to try to protect ourselves, to narrow our hearts, to climb deeper into our own isolation, to think more about our own personal triumphs and our own sorrows and our own struggles, to distance ourselves from other people's longing and loss and suffering, to shutter the windows and to lock the doors. And it strikes me that the only thing that can challenge that narrative is a very powerful counter-narrative. In South Africa, that counter-narrative is called Ubuntu, which literally means humanness or human kindness, or what we might call chesed. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu writes about the philosophical foundation of the notion of Ubuntu. He says that when you're in South Africa and someone asks you, "How are you?" you answer, "We are well," or "We are not well." Why in the plural and always in the plural? Because how can I be well if my sister is not well? Because how can I not be well if my brother just found love? We are interconnected. We are part of an extraordinary and intricate web of connection. He says that this delicate network of humanity is one in which my humanity is caught up in and inextricably bound to yours. And so in the concept of Ubuntu, when one person is diminished, everybody is diminished. When one person is triumphant, we are all triumphant. He says this is what it means to be truly human, to know that you are bound up in the bond of life. Does that sound like familiar language to us as Jews? He defines Ubuntu as being bound up in the bond of life. El Malei Rachamim, the blessing, the prayer that we say when we bury our loved ones. When we bury our dead, we say, Utsur bitzur hachayim, may his soul be bound up in the bond of life. In the moment of burial, standing over our dead, we remember in that moment that we are all connected to one another, that life's great calling is to recognize and to honor that sacred connection. And the final prayer that we say at the end of life is that our souls ought to be bound up in the bond of life with one another. Now, I was at a shiva not too long ago, and I heard the story of an extraordinary man who lived into his late 80s. And the story of his life was that he went on a Federation mission to Russia. And when he was there, the whole group was talking and looking at a site, and he heard some shouting happening a little bit down the road in an alleyway. And so he walked away from the group, and he saw a man who was beating his girlfriend or his wife. He's in another place where he doesn't speak the language and he doesn't know the culture, but he sees that this woman is being hurt and she cannot get away. And he goes over to the man and he starts screaming, "You must stop. This is not right." And this story, this one moment, which isn't about the great monuments, and it's not about articles that were written about him or publications that he made, this one moment becomes the defining moment of his life. Because this man, while he was alive, bound himself up in the bonds of life. That's just the kind of person that he was. How do we become bound up in the bond of life in our death? By binding ourselves up in the bond of life when we're alive. So the first way that our tradition tells us to counter the instinct of inaction when we see something happening, and our gut tells us intervene, but then our brain tells us don't intervene, you might get hurt, is to recognize a sense of shared humanity and to cultivate a sense of connection with other human beings. The second factor that undermines the instinct to not get involved when we see something that we really ought to get involved in. The second factor that reliably challenges the outcome of the bystander effect is, if a witness is warned before witnessing an event, the way that you react in this situation will be the determinant of how you are judged in your lifetime, okay? So in other words, social psychologists would create situations or environments in which they would see that people are inactive. But then they start warning people beforehand, I'm now going to put you into an environment and I'm going to judge your character based on how you act. Will you do something for the woman who's not budging on the beach in Hawaii? Or will you simply stand and watch or turn away and find another spot to set up your family, right? If we're warned, moral conundrum ahead, so we will actually behave with the best of ourselves moving forward. So think about what that means. There are two stories of Abraham that we read both on Rosh Hashanah. One is the story of Abraham sending away his son into exile. Another is the story, the next day, of Abraham nearly killing his other child. These are two pretty disturbing stories, and you might think that the rabbis had a strange sense of humor to place them both on the two of the days of the year when people are most likely to show up for services and yet not be able to ask questions. But they put these two stories of two trials. And in reality, Abraham didn't only have two trials, he actually had 10 trials that he was forced to undergo by the hand of God. Asara nisyonot nit nasa Avram Avinu. There were 10 trials that Abraham was tried in. Now, I heard a couple of years ago a really crazy story about a 30-year-old mogul who wanted to get engaged to his girlfriend. And so what he did was he faked his own death. He staged a car crash right at the place where they were supposed to meet. He hired stunt drivers and screenwriters and makeup artists to see how his fiancée-to-be would respond when she showed up to their meeting place and he was dead on the ground, okay? He thought this would make his proposal even more romantic. And by the way, she said yes, amazingly. And there's a similar story, actually, lest this seem, it is completely crazy, but there's a similar story that comes from the Talmud. There's a story of Rabbi Meir, who tests his wife Bruria's love, because he wants to see if she really loves him as deeply as she says she does. So what he does was he hires a student in the Beit Midrash, a younger, handsomer version of himself, to go home to his home and try to seduce his wife, to see if she really and truly loved Rabbi Meir, or if she would succumb to this suitor. I really often think that these tests of love are absurd, and one might wonder what then God is doing, putting tests of love before Abraham. Why would God try Abraham again and again and again? 10 tests, from leaving behind everything he knows and loves in the world, to sending away one child, to nearly killing another child. What kind of God would ask that of a man? And now I propose that maybe it's the kind of God who wants Abraham and all of his descendants to understand that all of life is a test, that the way that we respond to the most trying moments in life might actually matter. Meori Naim, who's a 16th century Italian rabbi, says that this is the lesson of all of those crazy trials of Abraham. That just as Abraham, our father, faced 10 trials throughout his life, so too every single one of us is tried over the course of our own lifetime 10 times. The whole of our lives is a series of trials. Each of us, trial after trial after trial. But the problem is, we can't tell which moment is a trial and which moment nobody's actually looking or paying attention. So we're compelled to assume that any given moment or any given encounter or experience could be one of the great trials of our lives. And the way that we respond or don't respond just might come to define us. It just might be the story that will be told about us at our Shiva. It just might be the thing that our grandchildren will remember about us and about our lives. There are many people who claim that human nature is to try to get away with as much as you possibly can if you know that nobody's looking. Plato claimed that. Many of us believe that. And Torah says that rather than fight against human nature, instead what we should do is train our hearts to assume that someone is always watching, that we might actually be judged for any one of these particular moments. Now, every single person in this room has faced a moment that has been a test. Some of these tests we've passed, and some of these tests we have failed. Some of these moments were moments where we buried our head in the book and pretended that we could not hear the person who was being excoriated by the professor, humiliated in front of the entire class. Some of us have experienced moments where we actually stood up and demanded that someone stop his cruelty. Some of us have experienced moments where we made the decision not to risk losing our jobs by standing up to our boss and saying that the way that one of the employees was being treated bordered on abusive. And others of us have decided that it was worth losing everything in order to stand up in just this way, in just this moment. We have all had moments in our lives, and there will be more to come. Nitivot Shalom, great Hasidic commentator from the 20th century, says that every single person is called to a shlichut elionah, a higher calling, that we are all sent into the world with a higher purpose, that through our trials and the way that we respond to them, we are actually able to achieve exactly what we were put into the world to achieve. That each one of us, he says, is called to greatness, and yet we have no idea what our moment is, and it might not be what we think or expect that it is. So we are people who are caught really between two impulses. On the one hand, the time-tested and scientifically quantifiable human impulse to hide and to pretend like nothing's happening, or to pretend that we're completely helpless, the bystander effect, to walk away precisely when it matters most. And on the other hand, the Jewish impulse, the legacy of Abraham, to understand that in fact every single moment is a test, that every single battle and every attempt at peace is a test, that every act of submission and every act of defiance could be your test, that the way that we respond to these moments, to the professor who professes bigotry, or to the person who deserves and yearns for the right to speak, even though not everyone in the room agrees with what it is she has to say, could be a determinant of our lives. All of us in our lives face these trials. And so we are offered by the Jewish tradition dual warnings, both of which happen to respond perfectly to the two impulses that undermine the desire to do absolutely nothing when given the chance to simply walk away or to intervene. On one hand, do not forget that we are all in this together. We are inextricably bound to one another. I may not look like you, I may not talk like you, but we are all connected, and your story is my story. And at the same time, moral conundrum ahead. Our tradition waves a big flag in front of us at every moment saying, you have no idea what the trial might be that you might face today, but believe me, this could be the moment that you were put into the world for. So the woman on the beach. I am ashamed to say that it took me several moments of perseverating and really gut-checking with my husband before I actually did something. And it wasn't until I saw the husband sort of nervously shake her and saw that she was completely non-responsive that we ran to the lifeguard station to get some help. And a few minutes later, the whole beach was covered with EMT and with police and with ambulance workers. I don't know what actually happened to her. I checked the police blotter for the next several days to find out, and I don't know. I do know that we did something. I also know that I let about 12 minutes pass between the time that I was really concerned and the time that I actually got the courage to step up and do something. But I'm really glad that my kids were there and that my kids watched my failure and they watched my triumph so that they would know that ultimately we made the decision to do something. I bless us all that we might find the insight and the strength to act bravely and decisively, to see in every single moment, both great and small, an opportunity for growth in strength and in courage. Because you never know. It just might be that what we do in this very moment actually matters. Thank you.